Welcome to another episode of OTA on the Air. Today with me, my guest is Paul Enos, who is the president and CEO of the Nevada Trucking Association and a longtime friend of mine and this association. So Paul, welcome to being on the show with us.
Tommy, great to be on with you.
Love hearing that voice. So you are the newly elected, I guess not newly elected,
Not newly. I think I'm halfway through.
Chair of the TAEC, which is the Trucking Association's Executive Council. I guess tell the viewers a little bit about what TAEC is and what the role of being chair is all about.
Sure. So, TAEC is the group of all the trucking associations across the country. So there's one of us in every state, although we have one guy who covers 2 states. So there's 49 of us across the country. We get together once in the summertime, and just us, as well as some of our sponsors and some of the partners that we work with. And we talk about how we can do our jobs better, whether it's government affairs, whether it's membership, financial structures. So we take that to have those kind of conversations so we can have stronger trucking associations for our members. In terms of the chair, really there's no power. It's just more work. It's just, hey, what can we do to, make all my colleagues' lives a little easier, make sure that we have better communication between all of us, and that we're focused on those issues that have an impact on all of us. So, one of the issues that I've taken on is emergency transport during these natural disasters. Our members end up running against all of these obstacles as they are moving line trucks or water trucks or whatever it is to help folks get out of these disastrous situations. Case in point, had a member from Nevada who was moving line trucks from Nevada to Iowa when they had a derecho in 2020. A derecho, for those who don't know, and I didn't know until I heard this term, is a land hurricane that wiped out a quarter of the trees in the Hawkeye State. So, that's kind of crazy when you think about it. Of course, the power lines were down. You had millions of people there without power. My member is bringing these line trucks that are owned by the same utility that owns the utility in Iowa. They also own the one in Nevada. So they're bringing the line trucks. They get to Wyoming, and Wyoming Port of Entry says, these trucks are too heavy. You got to empty them before we'll let them go across the equality state. Well, if you think about what that means, emptying all the tools and wire from a line truck is like sending the poor people in Iowa an empty toolbox, right? What are you going to do with it? So luckily they let 4 trucks go through, but for the other 30 that were on their way to Iowa, they said, can't come through Wyoming. So, let's go on I-70, right? Not quite the straight shot that Interstate 80 is, but, we can go on 70. Well, unfortunately, 70 was dealing with a wildfire, so it was closed. So they had to go all the way up to I-90 on the northernmost interstate that we have, and take another day and a half, 850 miles to get there. You think about what's happening in that day and a half. It's people in Iowa who don't have power for a day and a half longer, who don't have their refrigerators working, who don't have their air conditioners working. So, Tom, we really need to do a better job in this country. Hey, I love that we have different laws in different states that can do what they want, but we need to do a better job in terms of how we respond to these emergencies and these disasters to make sure that we're doing it in a way that makes sense, that when there is this natural disaster out there, that you're not told to, take another day and a half to get support to folks, that we can do it in a timely basis. Really, it's something that's either going to take action from all 50 states to recognize these disasters that happen all across the country, right? I mean, somebody in Wyoming, why do they think it's a big deal in Iowa where there's a derecho, right? And what is a truck from Nevada doing to go and support this relief effort in Iowa? We need to educate our folks that, yes, when we do have these kind of disasters, it's not just a regional emergency. Now we are handling these things on a national basis. And, until we get some kind of either memorandum of understanding from all the states or congressional action, I would just hope that people would implement the golden rule, and they would think about, somebody they love, their kids, their mom and dad, their grandma, who is sitting there without power, without air conditioning, without refrigeration, without communication, and say, yeah, instead of another day and a half, letting poor grandma sit there sweltering in the August heat, let's see if we can get the power on quicker. Let's just apply that golden rule and let the trucks roll.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that's one thing that that really kind of keystones your tenure as TAEC chair, is that really that collaborative information sharing, working together as states to making sure that we're doing common sense things and getting government out of the way. And I think that that's kind of your hallmark of this, is how do we collaborate better as state associations to be able to get the work done of our members. And that's a great example.
Well, and I will tell you, Tom, I really feel good because we have had conversations with the folks at AASHTO, which is the National Association, American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials. It's kind of I may have screwed something up there. But it is a great organization of all the departments of transportation across the country. And so working with them, partnering with them, I would hope that we could get some of this stuff done. Unfortunately, some politicians are going to listen a little harder if it's somebody other than the private sector, the trucking industry, who's asking them to do something. And, they may be a little more open to having government say, hey, we need to do this. I think we did get blessed. We had our former general counsel at the American Trucking Associations, Jennifer Hall. She's now the general counsel at AASHTO. So she and I have already had these conversations. I talked to Jay Timmons at the ATA Strategic Priorities Committee, or I think, what do they call that? The executive meeting of ATA about moving forward with some kind of breaking down these barriers so our members can properly respond to these types of incidents.
Yes, let's shift into that gear that you as TAEC chair get a spot on the ATA executive committee, which you just had your meeting there, and they made some changes to the strategic priorities of ATA. I guess walk the folks through how that process works, what things have changed, and why that really matters to the everyday trucking company owner.
Well, it's, we're all dealing with limited resources, whether it's trucks or labor. We have the same issue in state trucking associations. It's a matter, and national trucking association, it's a matter of bandwidth. So, we took a look at an issue that had been a top one priority, infrastructure, and said, hey, we had a victory. We got an infrastructure bill passed. So that went down. Some of the other things that we weren't successful in getting in the infrastructure bill, like truck parking, that has moved up to tier 1 status, which I absolutely appreciate. I think our truck drivers appreciate it. It's typically one of the top issues that drivers are concerned about when ATRI does their annual study of top 10 issues. So I think marrying that is with where the ATA is a good thing, and we can get some movement on that. A few years ago, we moved tort reform, which has typically been a state issue, into that number one top tier priority of the American trucking associations. So it really is a collaborative process. There is a lot of discussion about things that are going to move up the list, move down the list, or get taken off if there is a victory. So Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, that has been in place for just a little over 2 years now. January 6th, 2020, a year before the infamous January 6th, that was implemented. And it's doing what we wanted it to do. It's making sure that the people that are piloting our 80,000-pound rigs on the road, that they are not impaired by a substance. We've seen over 80,000 people get jettisoned out of the industry because they failed the drug test, and the lion's share of those are for marijuana. So that is an area where we can say, hey, we've had some success. A driver can't just go down the street and get a job at another trucking company after they've tested positive for drugs. So, there's an issue that has now been taken off of our priority list because we've had some success.
So on the issue of marijuana, you've really kind of heightened everyone's attention to that. I guess, what are you seeing from an industry's perspective on the impact of states adopting either medical or recreational marijuana use, and what needs to be done by the industry in order to mitigate some of that backlash that's coming at us when people are testing positive?
Well, Tom, we were one of the first half dozen states that legalized recreational marijuana. And it has been interesting to look at some of the data that's come out of the FMCSA clearinghouse. There isn't necessarily a correlation between more violations in your states that have legalized marijuana versus states where it's still legal. It tends to be more on a population basis. A couple of years ago, I was very fortunate to be a co-chair on the Controlled Substances Task Force to really look into this issue of marijuana and figure out what we had to do. Nevada was a state where we had legislation that said you could not deny hiring somebody because they tested positive for marijuana. We were lucky to get a safety sensitive carve out in that bill. But I think it really did make myself and a number of folks aware that this is an issue that isn't going to go away. We, I think, in this country need to do a much better job of looking at impairment versus usage with marijuana. When is somebody impaired on marijuana? Right now, the tests that folks have, they show usage. I said this a couple of years ago. Imagine if a truck driver was told they couldn't drink a beer on a weekend. That would probably limit the pool of truck drivers that we have. And, marijuana, for good or ill, is now in a lot of places being seen as, hey, you're drinking a beer. We have a process to determine whether somebody is safe after they drink a beer or not to drive. You take a blood alcohol test, a breathalyzer. You get if you're over that, what they call a per se limit, which means, it's in statute. There's a limit that you cannot exceed. For truck drivers, it's 0.04. For everybody else, typically it's 0.08, unless you're in the Beehive State, Utah. I think it's 0.5 for everybody. Then you're considered driving impaired. We need to kind of have the same test for marijuana to determine that impairment, because marijuana stays in your system for up to a month. So, hey, if a driver takes a 2-week vacation and wants to smoke a joint, that's going to be tough if they get called in for a drug test, and they're likely going to fail. So I think we need the federal government to really step in and help with that impairment research. Canada, where you have 40 million residents, it's legal in Canada. They have a time and task sensitive table that they use. You can't drive a truck or be on duty within 8 hours of using marijuana. Within 24 hours, you can't fire a gun, can't pack a parachute, use a laser, go rappelling. And then within 28 days, you can't be deployed overseas, be on a flight deck, be in a submarine, if you've consumed marijuana. So they don't have that per se limit. I'm not sure that that's the way to go. I think there is some good research being done in terms of oral swabs, which aren't as invasive as blood, that don't cost as much as a urine test does, where, if we have some research and we can kind of develop that and have that, here is where you're impaired on marijuana. I think that could take some of the taboo out of it. And, maybe then we could say, hey, you can do this if you're under this level.
Yeah, and that's always been the challenge with marijuana is it's a pass fail. Either it's in your system or it isn't, and if it's in your systems, it's assumed to be impaired.
And Tom, I will tell you something that's really interesting to me in talking to some companies that are doing hair testing. They're telling me that the results they're getting differ pretty tremendously from the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. The results they have, they say they're seeing more methamphetamine, more heroin, more cocaine than marijuana, which was surprising to me.
Right. Is that because they go back further than
just because you're gonna, cocaine is out of your system pretty quickly, in terms of a blood or a urine test. But for a hair test, you've got a lot longer, especially Tom, if they have hair like you and I do. Right. You're gonna get much more of a accurate test in terms of what that lifestyle is, as opposed to what somebody has done in a couple hours, a couple days, or a month.
You have a lot of truck drivers shaving their head like Britney Spears.
So I will say, we're still, even though you have those 81,000 people who have tested positive and not completed that return to duty process, I still would say we're safer than the general public out there. We still have better, we're still, as an industry, we have not crossed that Rubicon yet.
Yeah, without question. I mean, and you bring that up, and it's you had brought that up when we were together about a week ago. Was it's interesting that the American Trucking Association says we're 80,000 truck drivers short, and that the Drug Clearinghouse has 81,000 people on it. The interesting part would be to know is why those drivers have not done the return to duty part of it. Is they, there again, obviously their employer is going to separate them as a part of procedure, is in not knowing what that process is to return to duty. Is there an opportunity there for associations to step in and be able to provide that work, to be able to return them to duty or make them available for duty again?
Tom, it was crazy when we first legalized marijuana here in the Silver State. I had more calls than I'd ever had in my, I think 12-year career at the time, for folks asking about DOT certified programs. So substance abuse programs where people could go and complete that return to duty process. I think I had maybe had 2 calls before in the first 12 years. Within 6 months after it passed, I had 24. So, that was definitely becoming more of an issue. And, it wasn't necessarily somebody going and smoking a joint. It was somebody who had used CBD cream. CBD, they can call it CBD if it has less than 2% THC in it. Well, hey, it's CBD, there's no THC. They use it, they're still going to pop up positive on a urine test. So definitely an issue. And I mean, that's something that I did bring up at the Strategic Priorities Committee. I have to do some more research and bring something back again in May to see what we can do. So I'm going to work with our friends in Washington State and see what we can do to come up with a federal solution to this, because honestly, Tom, I think that's the only way that it's going to work. There's very few states that have the wherewithal to be able to come up with something that is that's going to be able to be applied across the board and have that one test that we can count on, say, hey, here's where you're impaired. Right now we're dealing with law enforcement training through the ARIDE program, advanced roadside drug recognition training that they get, where they're looking at, will their eyes like move or bounce if they've used marijuana, looking at some of the different ways that they detect whether somebody is impaired on that substance. But it sure would be nice to just do an oral swab. Here you go. And you can tell what somebody's impairment level is.
Well, yeah, and that's the interesting part is the news came out, this week that the DOT is accepted oral swabs as an acceptable method. There again, I think there's some advancements being made in that regard. And I think if you do have a national standard or some test that determines impairment with accuracy, that the conversation at the national level towards marijuana will probably change pretty considerably. I think that's probably the linchpin that's kind of holding a lot of that back, is that conversation, as a lot of states continue to do it, that the federal government's struggling with that fact that they have so many laws on the books, not only with trucking, but other industries when it comes to drug use and drug-free workplaces, that there's no way to test it appropriately.
No, I agree. And look, I still think, hey, employers should have that ability to determine what is it a zero tolerance policy? I mean, we still want that. And I mean, that has been a challenge in a number of states where they want to take an employer's ability from saying whether somebody, whether they're going to hire somebody or not based on a positive drug test, where that has been tried to be taken away. I mean, in Nevada, unless you're a safety sensitive position, you cannot deny hiring somebody solely on that positive drug test. So, there are some challenges that I think we are going to see as this moves down the road. And look, there are a number of other issues that can be quite controversial that tend to marry this one. I mean, you're going to get into the social justice argument. You're going to get into a discrimination argument, whether it's race or age, so, or medical status. So, I mean, there are a lot of issues around this debate that, in the states that were the pioneers for legalizing weed that we've already addressed, and we've kind of seen how some of these things play out. Not fun.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's shift.
Have a drink, Tommy. A legal whiskey.
There you go. Let's shift over to a cartoon that I'd never heard of before you introduced me to it. But talk to us a little bit about the mongoose method.
Well, oh, Ricky Tikki Tavi, great cartoon. I thought you wanted me to talk about that. This mongoose was in this was a Kipling. Rudyard Kipling. It was part of the Jungle Book. Ricky Tikki Tavi was this pet of this English family in India in the late 19th century. And there was this snake, Nag, that was going to kill the family. So Ricky Tikki Tavi is this mongoose who goes and kills the snake, protects his family. We've had, over the last dozen years, the trial lawyers come up with some extremely effective programs to sue general business as well as the trucking industry. And they call it the reptile theory. The reptile theory, the impetus behind that is we're going to the juror's reptile brain, where they need to protect themselves, their family, their community by awarding these large verdicts in truck accidents. So we've seen over that same period of time, the amount of nuclear verdicts over $10 million, increase by 967%. That's a number that ATRI came out with in a study that they did on the impacts of nuclear verdicts in June of 2020. And you look at that cost, I mean, those costs end up hitting insurance, that are insurance rates that end up hitting what we charge to move freight, that end up ultimately going to the consumers. So when I look at our ability to get something done in terms of tort reform or lawsuit abuse, it's an extremely difficult endeavor. Doesn't matter whether you're a red state or a blue state, the trial lawyers are very, very skilled and very good at what they do. And they have a tremendous amount of money. And they have a tremendous amount of resources to educate their compatriots in how to effectively go after every business, including trucking companies. And when you look at what they have against trucking companies, it's how do you prove negligent hiring? How do you prove negligence when you send a truck out in adverse weather conditions? How do you prove negligence in right turn, left turn, U-turn, rear end cases? I mean, they have a whole syllabus designed to sue trucking companies. So you take the reptile theory that they use, and going back to Ricky Tikki Tavi, Tommy, Ricky Tikki Tavi was a mongoose who was effective in killing that reptile. A mongoose is immune to venom, not afraid to attack. And when that snake strikes, it's able to dodge and dart and ultimately prevail. And so that's the theory behind the mongoose method. Let's do the same kind of training that our opponents on the plaintiff's bar are doing for their folks. Let's do that same kind of training for our trucking companies, for our defense attorneys, for drivers, for safety directors, for CEOs. Because when you watch some of these depositions where folks go in unprepared, you may not win a case in a deposition, but you definitely can lose one. So the thought behind the mongoose method to defeat the reptile theory is, let's provide our industry and the people that we rely on to defend us the same kind of training that the trial bar is doing. Let's just take a page out of their book. They've got reptile theory, we've got mongoose method. Nature has balanced those scales between a cobra and a mongoose. And my hope is we can rebalance the scales of justice, having that similar training that the other side has been doing for a dozen years extremely effectively, and that maybe we can start to see some of these judgments come down if we as an industry are better prepared when we're in the hopper on these cases where it's really bad if we've lost life or limb. But we also see them in some of the smaller cases. We have seen the amount of these verdicts just ratchet up and up and up. And there's a lot of reasoning and rationale behind that. So we have a neurocognitive behavioral scientist named Bill Kanaski. He's not an attorney, he's a doctor who helped us develop this program. We had our first training in November. Tommy, you were actually at the unveiling where I asked my board for permission to do this in November at the TCA conference. September, the TCA conference down in Las Vegas. They've had trainings in Iowa, in Indiana just last week. We're going to be doing another one in Reno, Nevada as part of our legal forum in May. So I'll invite any Buckeyes, if you want to come out to the biggest little city, love to have you. And I am an awesome host. Come on out and get educated. Although, Tom, I'm sure that's something that you're looking at putting together in the Buckeye State as well.
We are, but I would welcome people to join you in Reno as well. I mean, the interesting part about that whole process is it is when you see, especially your presentation of it, not the actual training of the mongoose method, but when you talk about what the trial bar does and the playbook that they have and the training that they have and how in depth they go, it should scare every trucking company out there to realize the system that's in place and how defined it is and refined. And it's amazing to see that side of that playbook of exactly how they're going to walk you into saying exactly what you think you should be saying, and then turn it on you to be extremely detrimental. And that's what the training does. And it's extremely important for trucking companies to understand that having the training before the accident is the most vital time to have it. I think that's one thing that Bill does a very good job of explaining is he can work with any situation, but the situations that are handled right from the beginning are the ones that are the easiest for him to repair. It's the ones that he says, I always get called in after it's too late, or I get called in after all the damage has been done, and I'm trying to put the pieces back together. That's I think what's the important part is you may, and hopefully you're never as a trucking company involved in one of these cases, but if you are, the cost of the training is a drop in the bucket compared to what the payout potential could possibly be.
And, Tom, that's another thing. We as an industry, whenever we're involved in lawsuits and we're dealing with insurance companies and we're dealing with the defense bar, it's all about cost containment. How are we going to contain the costs? Trial lawyers don't have that same concern. They spend a tremendous amount of money, not just on educating their attorneys, but they're also focus grouping juries. They're figuring out what argument to use to be able to get the highest verdict that they can. And we at least should be using the same kind of tools that they are to be able to figure out if we've got a case. Hey, there's sometimes, hey, the trucking company, we are liable. We're going to take that responsibility. We're going to move forward. But there's other times where it's a question. And, I think in those cases, you'll want to focus group it. You want to spend some money. You want to spend some resources to make sure you're not making those mistakes that the other side wants you to make.
Well, Paul, thank you again for coming on the show. Thank you for your leadership at TAEC and your friendship to the industry.
Well, hey, Tommy, thank you. Always good to see you, my friend. I love you. And hey, I'd love to have you come to Reno during that time if you can make it work. We'll go have a pecan punch at Louis.
At Louis. All right, Paul. Thank you so much.
All right. Hey, thank you, Tommy. Have a good one.
See ya.